the Reserve Bank has announced a scheme for sustainable structuring of stressed assets, as they call it. This news, of course, was something which Nisha had first alerted us to, that a new restructuring set of rules will be announced. And now that has come by. We are still awaiting the exact details. The resolution plan may involve one of the following options with regard to post-resolution ownership. Okay, let's look at the eligible accounts. What will be eligible for the new kind of restructuring? The project has to have commenced operations, so all the uncommenced power operations will not work. Okay, let me just give you the backdrop. This is for those assets which are about to turn bad, which have too much of debt, or those that have already been declared NPA. And what the Reserve Bank is doing is looking at a scheme whereby you save these assets from becoming bad by taking out the unsustainable portion of the debt and converting it into equities. Now, what is eligible? Project that has commenced commercial operations, the aggregate exposure of all the lenders in the account is more than 500 crore rupees, and the debt meets the test of sustainability as defined. Now, what is the test of sustainability? A debt level will be deemed sustainable if the JLF, that is all the lenders together, along with the experts, techno-economic viability experts, deem that the debt of the principal value amount, okay, now this is getting complicated, amongst the current funded, non-funded liabilities owed to insurance can be serviced over the same tenor as that of the existing facilities, even if the future cash flows remain at the current level. For the scheme to apply, sustainable debt should not be less than 50%. Okay, basically, if you have about 1,000 crores of debt, you should be able to pay at least 500 crores. Only then this recast or restructuring will be allowed. So now what is the sustainable part? The resolution plan may involve one of the following. The current promoter continues to hold the majority shares. The current promoter has been replaced with a new promoter, either through conversion of part of the debt into equity under SDR, or in some other manner, in a manner contemplated as per prudential norms. The lenders have acquired majority control. So in all these cases, the scheme will apply. That is when either the promoter continues, or a new promoter comes in, or the banks become the owners because they have maximum stake. Okay, what else do we have? In any of the circumstances mentioned above, the JLF shall bifurcate the current debt into Part A and Part B. So Part A will be, I think, the sustainable debt. Determine the level of debt that can be, including new funding. All right. Okay, so Nisha, we will just have to,
while you look at that, ma'am, so of course there is a mention of really an SDR. We have spoken about this at length. Some of the banks had really proposed. So citing the case of the strategic debt restructuring. All right, let's take it straight to the experts who have been proposing to the RBI on this as well. Jairam Sridharan, the CFO at Axis Bank, is on the phone line with us. Mr. Sridharan, so good to have you on the show. Of course, this is something that bankers and the RBI have been in constant deliberation on. Now, having looked at the guidelines, and of course, that's a large one, but the basic ones, the basic principles that have been mentioned, are they in line with what really bankers had proposed to the RBI?
Thanks for having me. In general, I think the guidelines have just come out, so one needs to spend some time studying it. But broadly speaking, this idea that there are some debt obligations which, if split into sustainable and unsustainable, that will create a better structure for these to be resolved quicker. I think that is very much in line with the kind of conversations we have been having, and I think it will create an environment where the assets can get resolved a little bit quicker, and with the present promoter or with new promoters, the banks, the lenders and the borrower can both sort of move forward in a more meaningful way. But one does need to spend a lot more time just looking at the details of exactly what has come out just now.
Okay, well, basically, you know, they have divided the debt into Part A and Part B, Jairam. The Part A is the sustainable debt, and at least 50% has to be sustainable debt, the project should have commenced operations. And of course, this only applies to over 500 crore debt. Now, part B, which is the unsustainable portion, shall be converted into equity, redeemable, cumulative, optionally convertible preference shares. However, in cases where the resolution plan does not involve a change in promoter, banks at their discretion may also convert a portion of Part B into optionally convertible debentures. All such instruments will continue to be referred to as Part B instruments in this circular. Valuation and marking to market will be needed, obviously, if it is converted into preference shares. And what I'm looking at it is whether this involves NPAs or standard assets, and what will be the provisioning plan.
So while Latha ma'am really looks at that, Mr. Sridharan, one thing I wanted to know, this has a mention of SDR, the particular guidelines have a mention of SDR at several places. Had the banks really proposed to abolish SDR, or you're going to still have that because SDR very much stays in certain cases? So do we have some understanding on where SDR will be applicable, and would banks be now forthcoming in doing SDR now that there is a system in place where SDR can be totally bypassed?
See, I'll say two things. One is that in terms of provisioning, the point that Latha was mentioning a little bit earlier, the moment you split into Part A and Part B, and Part B gets converted into equity or equity-like instruments, one would imagine, and I'll spend some time reading the guideline in detail, but one would imagine that this equity-like instrument would then need to get marked to market, and whatever is the differential, you will end up provisioning. So that's the way the sort of provisioning impact will come in immediately on converting into sustainable and non-sustainable. Now, as far as SDR is concerned, in an SDR situation, you're talking about working towards a change in promoter group. There are some situations in which that's going to be the desirable outcome. There are going to be some situations in which working with the current promoter group is going to be the desirable outcome. I think all these tools are important tools to have as we work towards resolution, and there is going to be no single solution which can be used as a cure-all for all the different kinds of assets that are out there.
Okay. So looking at this, Mr. Sridharan, just one question that I'm very curious about. Now that this particular option is given of SDR or non-SDR, and there are eligibility criteria, roughly, what percentage of the debt-laden companies that are really the list that is circulating and which is part of all the bank's balance sheet, how much percentage would really come out of that SDR option and could be eligible? Roughly, if you could give a percentage on that.
No, that's going to be really hard.
50%, is that what we can say? Because
no, I don't think, Jairam, 75% of the lenders will have to agree. Now, we know in many of the stressed cases, a large number of the lenders have already declared the asset as bad. I mean, take for instance SR Steel, or take for instance Bhushan Steel. A large part of the lenders have already declared it bad. Some have not. Do you, under the circumstances, expect 75% of the lenders to go with the, to give this scheme to the ones already declared NPA? Will that be priority?
Latha, as you're rightly saying, this is it has to be dealt with on an account-to-account basis. And one of the nuance that one needs to read into this, and again, once we read the wordings carefully, we will know better. In your example of certain lenders having declared it as an NPA and the others that haven't, is there a provision for the lenders that have declared it to also rechange classification? It's not clear to me. One needs to read it. And if so, then it makes things a lot easier. No,
where the promoter has changed, there is no problem. If the promoter has changed, then the SDR rules apply because you have changed the promoter. So you don't have to provide, it becomes a new promoter instance. Therefore, there is no question of provisioning. The asset classification also is standard. That they admit. But where there is no change of promoter, you have to provide for the Part B loans in 1 year. What it says is that in the case of Part B instruments, it shall be made within 4 quarters, commencing the quarter in which the resolution is passed. So you have to take full provisioning in 4 quarters of the hit that you suffer because of the change in the instrument from debt to a quasi-debt instrument. The point is, if you have already declared it as an NPA, then will bankers be really willing to extend this restructuring to those assets? Jairam, 1 minute. We are also joined by Mr. R.K. Bansal, the Executive Director of IDBI Bank. Mr. Bansal, the rules have come out and they are pretty much as we discussed in the morning. The loan of a stressed company is divided into A and B. A is the sustainable portion. That has to be minimum 50% of the total debt. The balance 50% or less can be converted into preference shares, convertible preference shares, even convertible debentures if the promoter is not changing hands. And they have to be provided for in 1 year, that is in 4 quarters. What is your sense? Do you see a lot of companies, do you see a lot of banks using this for many companies? What are your initial reactions?
I think there are a number of companies today in the system where perhaps finding new investors may not be possible because of the size of the companies. So certainly in those companies it can be used. But I think morning when we were discussing, we were saying it should be, it can be used for NPA also. But I think that is also, it's not required that it has to be standard in that sense. It only says the project has to commence commercial production. So even in those cases, it can be used.
In which cases can it be used? Even where it is an NPA?
I don't find, at least whatever I have read, it's not, it doesn't mention it has to be used only in standard cases.
No, it doesn't say standard cases.
Yeah,
but the point is 75% of the lenders have to agree. Now, if it is already an NPA in your books, will you be very keen to go with this restructuring for an asset already declared bad?
No. This notion is only in the, I think, TV channels, I would say. That once you say NPA doesn't mean that the asset is bad or good. The NPA is that company has not been able to service the interest. That is the
No, I'm asking you, as a banker, if you have declared an asset, if you have classified the asset as NPA, you've already taken provisioning, will you still be willing to give them this
provisioning is only
restructuring?
15 or 20% which banks have taken, let us say,
Yes.
in the beginning.
Okay.
But as I mentioned in the morning also, it's a choice for the bank between taking 70-80% hit or you want to take a haircut of the 20-30%, whatever, depending on the sustainable debt. Now, our problem is in the system today, if you make it NPA and if we close all the other channels, taps to the company, it will not be able to survive. The plant will get closed. And finally, you may have to sell, you still need a buyer.
Yes.
You may have to sell the plant either as maybe parts as scrap or maybe. So the value what you will realize after a long number of years will be much less.
Okay.
So if you can prove, and it has, as rightly said, 75% lenders have to agree, it has to go through an independent committee.
Yes.
So all those issues are there. So whatever outside consultant will make the report, so I think the safeguards are kept.
Okay.
So I would say banks will certainly be interested. There are a number of cases which we are stuck up. Neither we are nor we are able to go through SDR, nor we are able to do something else.
Okay.
We don't want to close the plants also. And especially in the steel and power sector.
Yeah, Mr. Bansal, I take your point. Let me just read the provisioning part to you and to Mr. Jairam and to Mr. Ashvin Parekh, who has just joined us. The key provisioning paragraph is as follows. Any provisioning requirement on account of difference between the book value of Part B instruments and their fair value as indicated in the previous 7.2 para in excess of the minimum requirement prescribed as per the above para shall be made within 4 quarters commencing with the quarter in which the resolution plan is actually implemented in the lender's books, such that the mark-to-market provision held is not less than 25% of the required provision in the first quarter, not less than 50% in the second quarter, and so on. So for this purpose, provision held already can also be reckoned. So basically, you have to account for it in 4 quarters. Mr. Jairam, what is your assessment? You think even already declared NPA loans will be taken up by lenders, or do you think they will first go for standard assets?
I think lenders would be interested, Latha. I think overall, I think this is a very pragmatically put together set of guidelines, and I think there is enough in it for all lenders to see it as a useful tool for realizing value and for them to find a way out of assets which are otherwise somewhat stuck, as Mr. Bansal was mentioning before. So I think there is a little here for everybody, and for the sake of prudence and health of balance sheet, I think the provisioning mechanism that has been mentioned is extremely appropriate as well, and the timeline that's mentioned is adequate for banks to make that right level of provisioning that's required. So overall, on the surface, seems extremely pragmatic.
Mr. Parekh, Ashvin Parekh is also in with us. Mr. Parekh, is this not restructuring in a new garb? I mean, this seems like a U-turn of the Reserve Bank's philosophy that it will not agree to restructuring. Now it has agreed, because I don't see the promoters losing much. There is only a potential upside which bankers will get. All the hit is coming on the banks, not really on the promoters. Is this not a new lease of life for beleaguered promoters or overly indebted promoters?
Well, actually, it has to be recognized that it is. I mean, personally, I look at it as some form of an additional lease of life, given to the lenders. And I suppose the reason could be very well understood or found. One of the reasons is that if we thought that on account of the economic situation or economic conditions, at least some of the sectors will start improving their performance, and therefore the ability of the borrowers in those sectors, to repay the loans will be much better. But we're not witnessing too much of that. So I suppose the underlying assumption with which even these guidelines have been drafted very well. And I suppose on the merits, on each and every case, individual case, it will depend on how the lender will use this facility. But I suppose the underlying concept is very simple. Very clearly, we distinguish between what is sustainable debt and what is not sustainable debt. And then at least in the case of sustainable debt, where there are cash flows, adequate cash flows to repay to the lenders, we segregate those, So I thought from that point of view, there's a clear admission. I can see that there's a clear admission that the earlier methods have only brought us so much results, and therefore additional leeway. So in some form, if the banker was doing it, you could have called it evergreening.
Yeah.
But now that there is a regulatory and government recognition that the situation demands, a situation like this. So to that extent, I wouldn't use the word evergreening. It's too harsh a word. But some form of recognition of performing asset of the borrower vis-a-vis the non-performing asset.
Okay.
Right. Mr. Parekh, stay on with us. I'll take it to Mr. Bansal. Mr. Bansal, what I have gathered from some of the corporates is that, and you can substantiate on that one, agree or disagree, that some of the SDR converted companies, you found it difficult to not only sell, but even get the board approval for really acquiring that particular company, getting your hands onto all the assets. Now, do you think there is a clear way and an option for the lenders to really convert these SDR companies into non-SDR and then again start from the scratch board by working with the promoters rather than taking it through SDR and converting the debt into equity? Is that conversion really likely to happen? Because as soon as this particular development happened, a lot of SDR related companies had also spurred in the market.
I think, as Mr. Parekh was also saying, some of these schemes which earlier RBI has announced had not really worked. And STR has been a matter of discussion. If you really see up to now, the real STR has happened only in one case. All other cases, we have still invoked the STR, and the second case, I think, is likely to happen. So the point is, you're right. STR requires promoters' cooperation and all that. But most of the problem, not promoter side. It is the problem is we have not been able to find an investor or buyer. And then even that investor requires a commitment from the banks that how much haircut you will take, and which banks have not been really agreeing to that extent.
So is are the bankers now given more power to take those haircuts with these guidelines, Mr. Bansal?
Certainly, not that way what you are saying, like say whether they can give more or less. At least this puts a system in place.
Yep.
Because today, if I take a part B, part A, whatever, we were not very clear what is sustainable, what is unsustainable, and then to whom we are giving.
Yeah,
The investor
Mr. Bansal,
Sorry.
There is a clause which says that malfeasance on the part of the promoter, if it has been established through a forensic audit, this scheme will not be applicable. So should we therefore understand that you have to do a forensic audit in all cases before you grant this?
I presume so. In any case, most of these cases, as you were saying, either they are maybe restructured earlier or they have been SDR or some cases. Most of such cases, as bankers, we already gone through forensic audit.
Okay. And also, we need to mention, our flashers are already mentioning that this will go through an overseeing committee or an OC as the press release calls it. The overseeing committee will comprise of eminent persons constituted by the IBA in consultation with the RBI. The OC members cannot be changed without the prior approval of RBI. And the resolution plan will be submitted by the JLF to this overseeing committee, and the OC will review the processes for reasonableness and adherence to provision guidelines. Opine on it, it will be an advisory body. Do you see a traffic jam in front of the OC, Jairam, or do you think there will be very few cases that will go to the OC anyway?
I think it is fair to assume that the OC will likely be busy. However, people feel their way towards it in the sense that once the committee actually gets set up, and it will take some time for it to get set up, I think people will try out a couple of cases, try and see how the committee opines on some of these cases, and that will set the guidelines for the future. I don't think you're going to see immediately a whole bunch of cases all lining up.
Okay. No, my bigger problem is what is the hit for the promoters? I don't see too much of hit, except that at a distant date, banks will have some of the shares of the company, some percentage of the shares of the company. Mr. Bansal, you all are taking more hit than the promoters, much, much more hit than the promoters, aren't you?
I think as we discussed in the morning also, promoters hit maximum. Most of these shares they already pledged, they have taken loans against that. Maximum what we can think of, we can reduce their equity also. See, I think what more hit you can give them? We can invoke their personal guarantee, then you will find they have no assets. So finally, when bankers are going through this route, only when no other option perhaps will work out, first of all, let us be very clear. And there are cases where it is not possible to find a new investor or buyer today. There are power plants, let us say power projects, which are stuck up. Without the existing promoter, it will be very difficult to complete those projects. These promoters are also stuck up. It is not that they are not taking a haircut.
Let me look at another problem that this might create. Even those who have intention of paying and ability to pay the loan might start saying that some of it is unsustainable debt. You are incentivizing people not to pay some of the debt, isn't it? I mean, of course, you will say that there is an OC and there are JLF and bankers will be prudent about it. But this is discriminating in favor of those who have overexposed themselves, who have over-indebted themselves, and discriminating against those who have been prudent. Mr. Parekh, as an outsider, what do you say? Isn't there a moral hazard in this whole thing?
There is. See, I'll tell you, I mean, basically no system is really going to really give you a complete 100% foolproof, a solid answer. But I suppose, once again, 2 or 3 things from the discussion and from reading the guidelines I can make out very clearly. Here we are. We've attempted several measures, JLF, SDR, several measures. In fact, willful defaulters is where it began. These measures have not really given us good results. Now, there's only one thing that I'm sort of finding in this. The guidelines seem to be a little more complete than the previous ones, to the extent that at least the OC element, to my mind, is a new introduction.
Yeah.
What it does is it takes away in some form, the fear of investigation. To a certain extent, in the sense if the lender, is of the view that, let's say, a certain, mechanism will work, and he is really paying much more. I mean, in the sense he is contributing much more to the losses. Despite that, let's say he wants to really take an opinion from the OC. At least to that extent, there is. So, from the point of view of investigation and fear of investigation, that element has been nicely introduced. I was observing that, in fact, when I was going through the guidelines. Overall, I would say it's one more measure. I can't see everything getting resolved over here. It's going to be a long journey. We are going to have, I suppose, few more interventions from the regulator and the government, in this regard.
Yeah.
Because very clearly the results are not there.
Okay, then there's another moral hazard, and I'm asking you because I assume that the bankers wanted this, and therefore they will not look at it as a moral hazard. But Mr. Parekh, you and I are not bound by these considerations. There was a point to which the Reserve Bank and the bankers had pushed errant promoters. They had arm twisted them, and probably some of them would have agreed to sell out. Now with this dilly-dallying, even those who probably had agreed to sell out are now going to say, why Reserve Bank is allowing you to give me a new lease of life? Why aren't you? We have probably allowed the banks to take off the pedal of this pressure. You wouldn't think with these new rules?
I would entirely agree with you. The reason is very simple. In as much as the lenders are sharpening their tools, I mean, let's not forget, so will the borrower. So if the borrower finds that there are different mechanisms, then he is also going to adopt or accept the ones which are more agreeable to him, more conducive to him. So, I mean, it's like a continuous battle between the borrower and the lender, but with more options thrown in, I suppose. It's not that more doors are opening up. Now more windows are also getting opened up to the borrowers. And then it will result in, so we'll have to see what results we get out of the whole process.
Mr. Sridharan, if I can come to you on this one, you did mention earlier, and we didn't pick that point, unfortunately, very, very well. There is one clause in the RBI's guidelines which says that citing the case of a SDR mechanism which provides 18 months for banks to really make prescribed provisions for the residual debt and mark-to-market provisions on their equity holding arising from conversion of debt, banks have represented for allowing more time to write down the debt and make the required provision in cases of resolution of large accounts. So clearly, are we seeing a system in which SDRs have not been completed? Now I know that the first SDR under SDR company was Electrosteel Steels. Its sale hasn't happened. 18 months would be completed in next 6 months or so, 5 to 6 months. So are we getting more time as relaxation for the sale process to happen here? Is that one of the takeaways also from this guideline?
I don't know that you can take that away from this guideline. I wouldn't. I think I would tend to see this as a new set of guidelines, a new way for account resolution, and not as a clarification on SDR guidelines that came out earlier. I think that would be a bit of a stretch.
Okay. But Jairam, will you all be, in cases where a loan is, I'm putting the same question that I asked Mr. Bansal. In cases where a loan is bad with you, but it is not, a loan is not bad with you, which I think is maybe SR in your case, but it has already been declared NPA by several other lenders. You may not get 75% of the people to agree to the proposal. Is that a likelihood that in these cases where some have declared it as NPA, some have not, it may be difficult to push the case?
Yeah, Latha, conceptually, there are a lot of accounts which are looking for ways to be resolved, and some of them are some of them are going to be resolved through existing tools, and some of them require new tools. No single tool is going to be powerful enough to resolve all the cases. So the question we got to be asking ourselves is: the new set of guidelines, are they a positive addition to the toolkit for resolution? And I think clearly the answer is yes. But are they going to be a panacea that's going to solve all the problems? I think clearly, again, the answer is no.
But considering Mr. Sridharan, and I would like both Mr. Sridharan and Mr. Bansal to really react to that, while we have seen the pitfalls of taking over control from the management, erstwhile management, and things haven't moved that much also because of lack of buyers in the market where economic conditions aren't great. Do you think that since all the bankers have unanimously really proposed this to the RBI, consensus building will be far easier now? And we know that there are certain cases in which there are 23 lenders in one particular account.
Mr. Bansal, you think consensus building will be easy?
Slightly better, but I can't give a guarantee that consistent building will be so easier, keeping in view the atmosphere in the banking system. But one good thing that Mr. Parekh was also, I think, saying, and which I was trying to say, is there is an oversight committee.
Yes.
Which, of course, earlier also we had an IEC system, but then the membership of the constitution was not very, I think it didn't really help that much, but at least it cleared all the restructuring cases. but it was not giving comfort to the bankers from the vigilance side. Today, whatever we have seen the discussion going into at government level or at IBA level or RBI level, this committee perhaps is likely to be slightly high powered, so which will give comfort, and that let us understand, bankers also understand their business, and this committee will also take this into account. So I hope with this, many of these cases which are stuck up, and I'm not saying 100% cases can get settled, sorted out by this. At least 70-80% cases, we can try to find a resolution now.
No, I don't want cases to be settled where the promoter is clearly, not beyond the pale of fair play. So I don't want 100% of cases to be settled. As a citizen, as a depositor, as a taxpayer, I don't want errant promoters to get an easy deal at all. But separately, Jairam, what's your sense in terms of your ability to force an errant promoter to give up control? Rules like these make it difficult, you think?
I think, Latha, that we got to respect the fact that we live in an environment of kind of limited liability, and also the fact that that for the economy to operate at its finest, it is important to create mechanisms through which risks are taken and risks get resolved with appropriate level of haircuts at all levels. Okay. And there's never going to be a perfect answer which is going to satisfy all parties. I understand and completely agree with your feeling that that active malfeasance has got to be discouraged, and depositors and bank shareholders can't be taken for granted. Yeah. I think that should play out, and I think it does in the way equity dilution ends up happening of particular promoter groups, etc. But it's not necessarily optimal to create mechanisms which just look for vengeance.
Yep. No, I take your point entirely. I think that is the practical issue to which the Reserve Bank has bowed its head, probably much against its wishes, but you cannot, the purpose of a legal and an economic and monetary system, banking system, cannot be to seek vengeance, as you say, but really to put assets back on track. So I take that ultimate practicability of the motive behind these set of rules. We are also joined by another big banker now. P.S. Jayakumar, Managing Director and CEO of Bank of Baroda, has joined us on the phone line. Mr. Jayakumar, you had, I guess, the maximum time to read. We pulled Jairam and Mr. Bansal even before they had a chance to fully read the rules. Your first take, do you see a lot of assets getting resolved and put onto the standard track because of these new rules?
I think there is opportunity, definitively. And this has been under discussion for some time now, so it's not much of a surprise except that it's now got codified and a framework has been provided. But I still do think where we do feel a sense that the NPS are on account of governance and other issues, banks should recognize there's a moral hazard in doing this without a change in the promoters. So that broadly it is. And the second point is it's almost like a pincer movement now. You got the DRT getting strengthened, you got the bankruptcy law coming in, and then you have this provision coming along. So I guess it makes a compelling case for promoters to work alongside with the bank where these options are offered and take it up.
So what has really changed, Mr. Jayakumar, in your view, since you have had the luxury to read the guidelines, the three important takeaways coming in from these guidelines? You did mention about the promoters and, of course, where do we stand in SDR mechanism and in terms of also how speedy the recovery or the process could be. So what are your key three takeaways from this?
The real issue, one of the issues that has been being discussed has been whether how banks are in a position to lend to accounts when they get into an NPA classification. And there has always been a concern of further lending to such companies when the core account itself is not performing. And then how do you deal with the additional amount that is being funded? So the first thing I think is it is possible for the banks to restore additional lending, working capital or otherwise, to ensure the company makes better profit and therefore can service its interest, etc., etc. So that is that I think is the objective. The second thing is, as I understand it, The other advantage is what is performing is not reflected anymore in NPA, because the RBI has such a rule that the account at that point of time is not standard. You have to wait for 1 year. Be that it may be, it represents the NPA number starts representing correctly. And third, I think there is a markdown provision for the portion that is converted to the equity. So that also hopefully brings a true valuation of the equity. And there's also provisions on how that should be valued.
Okay.
So I guess in all, I think it would accomplish two objectives. One, what is reflected in the NPA is not the whole of the account, and that to that extent it's a more accurate way to describe the quality of the account.
Okay.
And second, it provides a mechanism for bankers to now engage with the borrowers, with the customers, and then fund them more without having to worry about the nature of what the additional funding would be.
Okay. Well, we are running out of time, but I just want a rapid-fire question, and I want you all to tell me only what foremost comes to your mind. Mr. Bansal, what is the first three cases that might go through? In which sector?
Especially in the steel and power.
Steel, power only in those two sectors?
Yeah.
Okay. Jairam, by when do you think the first case will go through?
I think it all depends on when the OC gets set up. So I think that's going to be a key determinant of all the timing.
Okay. Well, Mr. Jayakumar, what is your sense? By the end of 2 quarters, how many cases do you think can be put on the road to recovery? Would it be 10 cases of 500 crores and above? Would it be 20 cases of 500 crore and above?
Well, it's difficult to say, but I would assume that in all instances where there is a degree of comfort on the underlying accounts in terms of governance, this should take place. Okay. And since the procedures call only for 75% of the borrowers to agree and the rest of them will follow suit, I think things can be done. But I think it will be a little bit more careful where there are concerns on the governance issues themselves and which possibly resulted in the NPA situation.
Okay, I hope that concern is there. And that is the last question to Mr. Ashvin Parekh. Mr. Parekh, if I were to ask you to score out of 100, how much percentage will you give this set of proposals for practicability? How much will you give it for moral hazard? Is it 60% practical? Is it 60% moral hazard?
Yeah, I would say 60% practical. I mean, 60% because it's one more step to, the original guidelines. And I would say from the moral hazard point of view, once again, it would be a good 70-80%. The reason is we're giving one more window out,
Yes, I take your point. I mean, you can't ignore the moral hazard that comes along with this. But I guess you can't speak of morality when there is so much of stress in the system. You'll have to give that to the bankers and definitely to the Reserve Bank as well. Jairam, Mr. Bansal, Mr. Parekh and Jayakumar, thank you very much for joining us and helping us understand this new set of guidelines that have come from the Reserve Bank. Basically, it allows banks to throw a lifeline to stressed companies, take out the unsustainable part of their debt and convert into equity. Hopefully, the bankers will get their money like they did in the case of Ispat. If you remember, many years ago, they did make their money when Jindal took over Ispat. So maybe even in this case, conversion to equity and turning of the steel cycle and the power cycle in the next 5-10 years will make the bankers rich. But at this point in time, it certainly gives wriggle room for errant promoters and good promoters who have been caught in the vice grip of delayed governmental decisions and a turn in the economic cycle globally. So there are some good promoters who will benefit. There are some honest bankers who are going to benefit. And there will be some errant promoters who are going to wriggle through because the rules cannot discriminate between good and bad, moral and immoral.